Mallory Green had planned the night for weeks. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a Saturday showing of a horror movie downtown at the Monarch Theater. The place had a reputation for its old velvet seats and flickering Art Deco lights, and Mallory, like a lot of kids her age, was fascinated by the idea of watching something terrifying inside a building that already felt haunted. She was 15, smart, thoughtful, the kind of teenager who kept her circle small and her world even smaller. Honor roll student, worked weekends with her aunt at the flower shop, never came home past curfew. That night, she asked her mom if it was okay to go alone. Her best friend had backed out at the last minute, but Mallory still wanted to see the film. Donna Green hesitated, but her daughter had never given her a reason not to trust her. So around 6:40 p.m., Mallory left the house in a gray hoodie and jeans, with just enough cash for a ticket and popcorn. It was the last time Dana ever saw her. Security footage from the Monarch Theater would later show Mallory entering the building just after 7 p.m., standing in line at the concession stand, and then walking down the central corridor toward Theater 3. She looked calm. No one was with her. She wasn't followed. The timestamp was 7:06. The film started at 7:15. There's no footage of her ever leaving. The manager on duty that night told police she probably exited through the left side hallway after the movie let out, a common shortcut that led to a side alley behind the building. There were no cameras in that area. He said the side door sometimes triggered the building's security chime, but it hadn't gone off that night. He couldn't remember seeing her face. And because she'd bought her ticket in cash, there was no digital record tying her to the theater, except that brief surveillance clip at the front entrance. It was enough to confirm she made it inside. After that, it was like she vanished. When Mallory didn't return home by 10 p.m., Donna started calling her phone. No answer. She called again. Then again. Straight to voicemail. She waited until 10:45 before getting in the car and driving the 10 minutes to the Monarch herself. The lobby was empty. The final screenings were ending. She flagged down the same manager, asking if her daughter was still inside. He brushed her off at first. Kids run late all the time. Maybe Mallory had gone to get food with a friend. But Dana knew better. Mallory hated being late. She never ignored calls. She would have told her. Something felt wrong. By midnight, Dana had reported her missing. Louisville police initially logged it as a possible runaway. They ran her name through missing juvenile databases, checked social media, and started making calls to friends. Her phone last pinged near the theater around 7:08 p.m., right when she walked inside. Then it went silent. Mallory had no history of mental illness, no boyfriend, no fights at home. Her internet, history, according to police, showed nothing alarming. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't taken extra clothes. She had no driver's license, no access to a vehicle, and no reason to leave. By Monday morning, local news picked up the story. 15-year-old girl vanishes after movie night became the headline on every TV screen in Jefferson County. Donna appeared in a press conference outside the police station, holding up a school photo of her daughter in a pale blue sweater. Her voice trembled. She kept repeating the same sentence. Mallory wouldn't just disappear. Flyers went up at bus stops, community boards, gas stations. Police organized their first official search that afternoon, starting with a full sweep of the Monarch Theater. Officers walked every aisle of Theater 3, checked utility closets, back hallways, and emergency exits. Nothing stood out. A single custodian mentioned seeing a young girl walking toward the hallway near the old projection room before the movie let out, but he couldn't confirm if it was her. The exit door in that hallway hadn't been used in years. It was supposed to be sealed according to the building's fire code. But the latch was broken. The manager said it was always like that. No one seemed to know exactly when it had last been repaired. As the hours turned into days, theories began to swirl. Maybe Mallory had snuck out and gotten into a stranger's car. Maybe she'd had a secret plan no one knew about. Or maybe, though no one wanted to say it out loud, someone had taken her inside the theater, and no one had noticed. There were no witnesses, no known threats, no signs of a struggle, Nothing to suggest what direction she might have gone, only that short clip of her walking in, the swinging glass doors closing behind her. And then, nothing. Just silence. And in that silence, something began to settle. A kind of dread that maybe this wasn't just another missing teen story. Maybe it was something worse, something the building itself wasn't ready to give up. Detectives arrived at the Monarch Theater just after sunrise on Monday. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that clings to quiet buildings long before doors open to the public. The initial walkthrough had been hurried, standard missing persons protocol. But now, with more than 30 hours past and no sign of Mallory Green, the investigation shifted from possibility to urgency. They started with the side hallway, the one the theater manager said Mallory might have used to leave. It ran alongside the rear exits, dimly lit and barely wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. The door at the end led to an alley behind the building. No camera, no alarm. No one had seen her step through it. A snack bar worker came forward, saying they thought they'd seen Mallory heading that way, but the memory was fuzzy. The movie she attended was still playing when they caught a glimpse of a girl in a gray hoodie near the hallway entrance. The timing didn't make sense. Mallory would have had to leave partway through the film. Her mother swore she wouldn't. She hated missing the ending, even when it scared her. But the image stuck, just a flicker of movement. That was all they had. Outside, the alley was checked for security footage from neighboring buildings. Nothing. The only angle that might have caught her, an old bank camera across the street, had stopped working 6 months earlier. Investigators walked the path she would have taken had she left through that door, canvassing storefronts, dumpsters, drainage grates. They found nothing. No dropped phone, no hoodie, no trace that anyone had stepped into the night from that exit. Back inside, they pulled the theater's internal maintenance logs and camera system. Most of the building's cameras were installed years ago and covered the front lobby, concession stand, and main corridors, none near the projection rooms or exits. Detectives reviewed hours of footage again, slowing it frame by frame. Mallory walked in. She bought popcorn. She entered Theater 3. Then, nothing. No movement toward the hallway, no image of her in the lobby again. It was as if she had evaporated into the structure itself. Flyers began to spread across Louisville, taped to light poles and gas station windows. Donna Green stood outside the Monarch daily, sometimes handing them out herself. She wasn't crying anymore, just pale, stiff, and silent. Local news vans parked across the street, broadcasting from the sidewalk with bright lights and empty words. The public started talking. Some speculated Mallory had met someone online. Others whispered about predators or trafficking. But the details didn't fit. No online activity, no signs of grooming, no history of instability, just one girl in one theater, gone in one instant. 3 days into the investigation, a cadaver dog team was brought in. They started at the exit door and worked their way backward through the building. The dogs sniffed every inch of the carpeted hallway, then Theater 3, then backstage storage rooms. Nothing. No alerts. No indication of death or struggle. They moved to the basement level. Old boiler rooms and electrical corridors barely touched since the 1980s. Still nothing. The dogs paced. The handlers looked defeated. The building seemed too clean. Then came a curious note from a janitor who'd worked at the Monarch for nearly a decade. He told detectives that weeks before Mallory disappeared, he'd noticed a man spending time near the upstairs projection booth during off hours. The man didn't work there, at least not officially. He said he assumed it was someone brought in for maintenance, no uniform, no name badge. Just someone tall, quiet, and always watching. He couldn't give a description, couldn't remember the face, just the feeling that whoever it was didn't belong there. Detectives tried to track down past employees, freelancers, anyone who might have had access to projection equipment or building schematics. Most names led nowhere. Former staff who had moved away, old phone numbers, dead ends. The manager confirmed that from time to time, outside techs were brought in for calibration or minor repairs. But there were no records from that fall. Nothing that tied to the janitor's vague description. The building itself became the focal point. Detectives ordered a second inspection, this time with blueprints in hand. The Monarch had been built in 1928, retrofitted dozens of times and partially remodeled after a small fire in 2006. Over the years, walls had been moved, stairwells sealed, old service elevators repurposed. There were rooms on the blueprint that no longer existed, or didn't seem to, and others that existed physically but weren't marked on any current plan. That uncertainty disturbed the lead detective. If someone had knowledge of the building's older structure, former blueprints, forgotten hallways, it wasn't impossible they could move undetected. Use shadows, use silence, use access points no one thought to check. But still, there was no sign of Mallory, no phone activity, no bank card usage, no sightings. As October slipped into November, the case stalled. Tip lines went quiet. Dinah's nightly vigils outside the theater became a painful routine. People in the neighborhood started avoiding eye contact, unsure whether to offer hope or distance. The Monarch resumed its regular movie schedule by the second week. Teenagers returned, popcorn machines hummed, but something felt off, like the walls were keeping something, like they knew. And as investigators closed up their files for the weekend, a note was scribbled into the margin of the case report. Revisit janitor's statement, projection booth loiterer, identity unknown. In the weeks following Mallory Green's disappearance, the Monarch Theater transformed from a local landmark into the center of something darker, something unknowable. Its worn Art Deco facade, once nostalgic, now looked oppressive. The marquee lights flickered like a nervous tick. People still came to see movies, but there was a subtle shift. Conversations quieted near the concession stand. Eyes lingered too long near the hallway to Theater 3. Parents stopped letting their kids come alone, but behind the scenes, online in group chats, on late-night live streams, the Monarch had become something else entirely, a mystery people wanted to solve. It started with a Reddit thread titled, "Girl Disappears at Louisville Theater, What's Not Being Said." The post linked to architectural drawings from the city archives showing the Monarch's original 1928 floor plan. Commenters pointed out discrepancies between the blueprint and the current layout. One user claimed to have worked there in 2010 and remembered a door that just vanished during a renovation. Another posted a blurry photo of an old wooden staircase tucked behind a storage closet that no longer existed. It didn't take long for amateur sleuths and self-appointed investigators to start speculating. Secret rooms, hidden tunnels, even ritualistic theories that had no place in reality, but kept getting clicks. TikTok videos followed. One creator, a paranormal influencer with 500,000 followers, made a series about the Monarch's haunted history. She highlighted newspaper clippings from the 1940s about a stagehand who'd fallen to his death during a production of Phantom of the Opera. Another video suggested that Mallory's disappearance mirrored the 1986 case of a missing custodian whose body was never found. There were whispers that the building had been cursed, that the original owners were involved in organized crime, that something had always been wrong with the Monarch. Donna Green watched some of these videos late at night, alone in the living room, volume turned low. She never commented, never liked it, but she watched. And sometimes she replayed them, especially the ones that talked about hidden spaces. Because even if the tone was wrong, even if the speculation made her stomach turn, the central idea still rang true to her, that the building itself might hold the answer. Meanwhile, the investigation tried to keep pace. Detectives expanded their interviews to include past and temporary staff. Everyone who'd worked at the Monarch in the year leading up to October 2013 was contacted or located, except one, a projectionist named Scott Ellery. His employment file was incomplete, no forwarding address, no emergency contact. He'd been hired for weekend evening shifts starting that August and stopped showing up in mid-September. The manager hadn't thought much of it, turnover was high, and Ellery was quiet, kept to himself. But now, with a missing girl and a growing sense that something had been missed, Ellery became more than just a loose end. He became a question mark. Detectives searched for him through DMV records, tax filings, and social media. Nothing current. His last known address was a rented room in a multi-unit house about 20 minutes from the theater. By the time officers arrived, the building had new tenants. No one remembered him. The landlord said he'd left without notice, owed 2 weeks' rent, and never came back for a duffel bag left in the closet. The bag was long gone. But even as police pursued leads, the internet moved faster. One TikTok user posted a video from inside the Monarch, recorded after hours during a private event, showing a maintenance hatch behind a staff restroom. The video went viral. The hatch led to a narrow crawl space that, according to captions, wasn't on any current map. It stirred panic and fascination. Conspiracy groups began emailing the Louisville Police Department demanding they excavate the entire building. Some accused the city of covering up something sinister. Others accused the theater owners. Dana, in a rare statement, begged the public to stop treating her daughter's disappearance like entertainment. Inside the department, detectives grew frustrated. The real leads were stalling. No new physical evidence had emerged. Mallory's phone had never been recovered. No digital breadcrumbs, no credible sightings. Her disappearance was less a case than a void, an event with no shape, no aftershock. Just silence. It left a cold trail, one that felt less like it had been cleaned and more like it had been swallowed. Still, they kept coming back to the projectionist, to the side hallway, to the fact that someone might have known the theater better than anyone realized. Maybe not someone obvious, not a manager, not a headline-making suspect. Maybe someone quiet, invisible, drifting in and out of jobs and walls. Someone who knew what parts of the building no longer existed on paper, but still existed in wood and brick. By early December, the case was still technically active, but no new statements were being taken, no new searches scheduled. Leads were labeled non-viable or internet noise. Dana's calls to detectives started going unanswered, and inside the Monarch, movies played as usual. Teenagers laughed, workers swept popcorn into dustpans. But sometimes, when the building emptied out and the last bulb dimmed, there was a feeling, shared by a few staff members and never spoken aloud, that the place wasn't fully empty. That somewhere between the walls, something was still unfinished. The search for Mallory Green began with urgency and flashing lights, but as the months dragged on, the energy surrounding the case began to thin. Leads dried up, tips went cold, and even the media that once flooded Dana Green's lawn eventually turned its attention elsewhere. The first year was the hardest. Detectives explained in careful, rehearsed tones that there was nothing more they could do without new information. The official status shifted quietly from active investigation to inactive file. To Donna, it felt like watching her daughter vanish a second time. This time, not from a theater, but from the world's memory. The fracture lines inside the Green family deepened. Donna and her husband, Robert, had been separated long before Mallory disappeared, but the tragedy brought him back into her orbit. Instead of comfort, it ignited conflict. Robert blamed Dana for allowing Mallory to go to the Monarch alone that night. He said she should have driven her, should have waited outside, should have done anything other than trust a teenage girl's independence. The words lodged like shrapnel. Donna fired back that Robert hadn't been there at all, that he'd abandoned them long before. Their grief never found common ground. What began as tense phone calls had evolved into courtroom arguments over finances, custody of memories, and the shape of their broken family. Donna's focus narrowed to a single ritual. Every Saturday evening, at the exact time Mallory had entered the Monarch, Donna drove downtown, parked across the street, and stood outside the theater holding a candle. For the first few months, dozens joined her, neighbors, classmates, co-workers. But as the weeks bled into seasons, the crowd thinned. By the anniversary of Mallory's disappearance, it was only Dana and a few flickering flames that fought against the shadows of the theater's walls. Mallory's school friends carried their grief differently. At first, they posted photos, wrote tributes, even organized a fundraiser to help the Green family print flyers. But teenagers grow fast. Time moves differently for them. By the second year, most had quietly stepped back, unable to live every day in mourning. Lockers were repainted, classrooms filled with new students. Mallory's absence became more like a whispered rumor than an open wound. Dana couldn't blame them, but she noticed. The silence from their side cut just as deep as the silence from the police. Instead of letting go, Dana grew sharper, more deliberate. She began collecting every scrap of information she could find about the Monarch Theater. At first, it was clippings from old newspapers, articles about the building's opening night in 1928, about a fire in the 1970s, about renovations in the early 2000s. Then, it was photocopies of architectural plans she requested from the city archives, blueprints marked with dates, lines, measurements. She spread them across her dining room table, using colored pens to trace out hallways and service shafts, comparing what once existed with what stood now. She circled areas that seemed inconsistent, a stairwell leading nowhere, a storage room that wasn't marked on later diagrams, a crawl space noted in pencil, but not in ink. Family and friends tried to intervene. They told her the obsession wasn't healthy, that she needed to take care of herself. But Dana wasn't listening. She believed, deep in her bones, that Mallory hadn't simply vanished into thin air. Someone inside that building had seen something, done something, or hidden something. She believed the Monarch itself was keeping the secret, and that the police had been too willing to walk away. Robert stopped visiting by the second anniversary. He said Dana was wasting her life in paperwork and conspiracy. He wanted to believe Mallory had been taken by someone passing through, that she was already gone, that closure could come from acceptance. Dana rejected that. She clung to the walls of the Monarch like a lifeline, convinced that if she dug far enough into its blueprints, its logs, its forgotten corridors, she would uncover what investigators had missed. At night, Dana kept binders stacked by her bed, filled with maps and timelines. She replayed the security footage until the faces of strangers burned into her memory. She studied the grainy clip of Mallory walking inside until it became a ghost she couldn't turn away from. While others moved on, Dana stayed locked in that night, certain that the truth hadn't left either. And deep down, though she never said it aloud, she began to believe something chilling, that whatever happened to her daughter, the Monarch Theater itself had swallowed her whole. By 2017, the name Mallory Green was spoken less often in Louisville. Her posters were faded, her case file gathering dust, and the Monarch Theater had resumed its cycle of movies and midnight screenings as if nothing had ever happened. But inside Dana Green's home, the case was anything but forgotten. Her dining room was still buried in binders, marked up floor plans, and news clippings. Every night, she pored over the same documents, desperate for a detail everyone else had missed. And then, in early spring, something arrived in her mailbox that would jolt her obsession into overdrive. It was an envelope with no return address, postmarked from somewhere in Kentucky, but impossible to pin down further. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, written in block letters that looked deliberately unnatural, as if someone had tried to disguise their handwriting. The note contained only one sentence. She never left the theater. Checked the old projector room. Dana read it again and again, her hands trembling. It was the first new clue, real or not, that she had received in years. She turned the letter over to the police immediately. Though skeptical, detectives couldn't ignore the possibility. They reopened Mallory's case for a short period, narrowing their focus to the Monarch's projection area. The theater had undergone remodeling in 2014, less than a year after Mallory vanished. Old projectors had been removed and replaced with digital systems, walls had been patched, and new flooring installed. Detectives retrieved building permits and maintenance logs from the time. One entry stood out, a repair order referencing the sealing of subfloor access in the projection wing. The language was vague. It suggested a portion of the original floor had been covered, possibly closing off an access panel or maintenance chute. For Dana, it was enough to confirm what she had always believed, that something inside the Monarch had been hidden. For investigators, it was thin. Still, they brought in a small search team and arranged for partial demolition of the projection floor. Dana stood outside on the sidewalk during the inspection, staring up at the windows where her daughter's last movements might have been connected. The sound of hammers and drills echoed faintly above her. She prayed that at last, something, anything, would come out of those walls. The search was meticulous, but ultimately anticlimactic. Workers tore up sections of the projection room floor, checked beneath for concealed spaces, and tapped along the walls for hollows. They found nothing unusual, just concrete reinforcement, a few rusted pipes, and insulation that looked decades old. No remains, no clothing, no phone, nothing that could be tied to Mallory. When police announced the results, they described the tip as non-actionable and unsubstantiated. The building, they said, gave them no evidence to suggest foul play had occurred there. Dana felt a mixture of devastation and vindication. On one hand, nothing had been recovered. On the other, the note had been right about at least one thing. The projector room had changed after Mallory disappeared. That single truth was enough to deepen her conviction that renovations weren't just cosmetic. They were concealment. Investigators traced the letter, hoping to authenticate it. They tested the paper and ink. They dusted the envelope for prints. Nothing useful came back. The paper was ordinary, the pen common, and the envelope handled too many times to isolate a single profile. Postal authorities confirmed only that it had been dropped into a general collection box. The handwriting expert called it deliberately obscured. Whoever wrote the note didn't want to be identified. The police closed the case again within weeks, filing the letter away with dozens of other tips that had led nowhere. To them, it was just another cruel message in a sea of dead ends. But to Dana, it was proof. Someone knew, someone had been there, inside the Monarch, maybe even during the renovations, and had chosen to whisper the truth instead of coming forward. In the quiet of her home, Dana kept the note folded in a plastic sleeve at the front of her binder. She looked at it nightly, mouthing the words to herself like a mantra. She never left the theater. They burrowed deeper into her thoughts, until the Monarch was no longer just the place where her daughter disappeared. It was the place where her daughter still was, or had been, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one found her. That anonymous tip marked the beginning of a new chapter in Dana's obsession. If the walls hadn't revealed their secret yet, she believed they eventually would. And when they did, she vowed she would be standing there to see it. By 2025, the Monarch Theater was no longer the charming relic that once drew in late-night movie crowds. The building had limped along for decades, its electrical wiring outdated, its plaster walls cracked, and its old projection systems gutted and replaced by temporary fixes. When a small electrical fire broke out in one of the upper wings in February, the city finally declared the structure unsafe. Within months, it was sold to a private development company with plans to transform the property into a modern entertainment complex, luxury seating, neon signage, sleek restaurants. For many in Louisville, the announcement marked the end of an era. For others, it reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Local news ran a nostalgic feature on the Monarch, painting it as a fading jewel of downtown. The segment included a brief mention of Mallory Green, the 15-year-old who had walked into the building in 2013 and never walked out again. It was a single line in a longer story about architectural history, but it was enough. Within days, Mallory's name was trending on social media again. Old videos resurfaced, new threads appeared, and speculation reignited. For online sleuths, the timing was too perfect to ignore. A building long suspected of hiding something was finally going to be torn open. The renovation crew got to work quickly. Their task was straightforward: strip the Monarch down to its skeleton, remove anything unsafe, and rebuild from the ground up. But within the first few weeks, strange details emerged. Workers reported pulling down drywall only to find uneven studs and layers of insulation that made no practical sense. In some areas, behind thin sheets of plaster, there were empty cavities bricked off, small voids sealed without explanation. One foreman told a reporter off the record that it looked like patchwork, not structural necessity, but deliberate concealment. Other discoveries followed. In the sub-basement, where the old boiler system had once operated, crews uncovered remnants of narrow passageways that didn't align with modern floor plans. Some were filled with debris, others with concrete. A few contained traces of wood framing, suggesting they had once been used as tunnels or crawl spaces. The workers shrugged it off as part of the theater's eccentric history. But for those who had followed Mallory's case, the implications were chilling. The online community dissected each rumor in real time. Photos of exposed beams and gutted hallways circulated on Reddit and TikTok, sparking theories that the renovation would finally uncover what police had failed to find 12 years earlier. Some users even predicted that Mallory's remains were inside the walls, pointing to the anonymous letter Donna Green had received in 2017. Comments flooded with speculation. They'll find her in the projector room. Watch, it's under the floors. The building always knew. Dana, now older and frailer but no less determined, watched these developments with a heavy heart. For more than a decade, she had insisted that Mallory never left the Monarch. Every article about the renovations was clipped and added to her binders. She made quiet calls to the Louisville Police Department, asking if they would be present during the work. For once, she didn't feel dismissed. In the background, the police department had assigned a new detective to review cold cases in the region. The file on Mallory Green was re-requested from storage. Reports, photographs, and video evidence were spread across a desk once again. This detective, younger and unburdened by the frustration of past dead ends, saw something others had ignored, a building now being opened up in ways it never had been during the first searches. A structure once protected by walls, plaster, and history was being stripped bare. The detective arranged for closer coordination with the development company. Any irregularities, sealed spaces, unusual voids, or hidden rooms were to be documented and reported. For the first time since 2017, Mallory's case was no longer dormant. It wasn't officially reopened, but it was alive again, pulsing faintly, tied to the sound of sledgehammers and drills echoing through the Monarch's skeleton. As more walls came down, the whispers in Louisville grew louder. Some treated it as gossip, others as folklore, but for Dana it was something different. It was a promise that the building which had swallowed her daughter might finally be forced to speak. And when it did, she knew the truth would be something no one could ignore. It was late in the afternoon when the sound of a sledgehammer striking drywall echoed through the Monarch Theater's rear projection hallway. A demo team had been tasked with stripping down the corridor, one of the least used sections of the building, long since converted to storage. As layers of plaster and framing came down, one worker noticed something strange. Behind the studs was a hollow space that wasn't on any renovation plan. At first, they assumed it was just poor construction from decades past. But as they pulled away more debris, the outline of a sealed vertical shaft began to emerge, tall, narrow, and bricked off with care. When the last piece of drywall gave way, the stench of dust and rot filled the hallway. Packed inside the shaft, layered tightly with old insulation, was something no one expected to see: the remains of a human body. Wrapped in a hoodie and jeans, partially preserved by the dry air, the figure had been hidden away for so long that it looked more like a relic than a person. The demo team froze. Work stopped. Phones were pulled out. The police were called immediately. Within an hour, the area was sealed off with tape. Detectives and forensic teams arrived, moving slowly and deliberately. They eased the body out of the shaft, documenting every layer of material that had been packed around it. At the bottom of the cavity, crushed beneath insulation and debris, they found a torn backpack. Inside, wrapped in decay and dust, was a phone, the same model Mallory Green had carried when she walked into the Monarch 12 years earlier. The confirmation didn't take long. Dental records matched the remains. The girl in the wall was Mallory, the girl whose name had hung on missing posters, whose mother had held candlelight vigils for years, had finally been found. Forensics moved carefully. The remains showed no signs of natural collapse or accident. This had not been a place someone stumbled into. It had been a place someone was put. Investigators noted fractures to the skull, evidence of blunt force trauma. The cause of death was no longer a mystery. Mallory had been killed, and the shaft itself told its own story. Records, confirmed that the space had once been part of an old dumbwaiter system used in the Monarch's earliest decades to move reels of film and supplies between floors. The system had been decommissioned long before Mallory disappeared. At some point, it was sealed, plastered over, and painted to look like an ordinary wall. Whoever put her there had known the building well enough to use its forgotten spaces and had worked quickly enough to close it up before anyone noticed. The realization was chilling. Mallory hadn't left the theater because she couldn't. She had never been outside to be seen. She had been hidden within the very structure that people walked past every day for over a decade. Detectives combed through old permits searching for records of when the wall had been sealed. They found paperwork from 2014 citing structural reinforcement and fire safety updates in the projection wing. But those documents didn't explain why the shaft had been filled with insulation or why the exterior looked seamless with no trace of patchwork. To the police, it was clear. This wasn't an accident. Someone had used the renovations as cover for concealment. The discovery brought a flood of emotion through the city. For Dana Green, the news came as both confirmation and devastation. She had said for years that her daughter never left the theater. Now she was right, but at a cost she could barely endure. The vigil candles she had lit for so long were no longer for hope, but for grief. She had wanted answers. What she received was the weight of a truth she had suspected all along. Investigators began piecing together how Mallory's final moments might have unfolded. She had gone upstairs, or been taken upstairs near the projection area. She had been struck, killed quickly, then hidden in a shaft no one remembered existed. The perpetrator had sealed it carefully, plastering over the wall so that even building inspectors later failed to notice. Mallory's body remained there, silent and undisturbed, as movies played above and crowds laughed in the lobby below. 12 years of questions had led to this point, but the answers weren't clean. They raised new mysteries: who had the access, the time, and the knowledge to use that shaft? Who had hidden the body so thoroughly that even police dogs in searches had missed it? And perhaps most haunting of all, had someone tried to warn them years earlier with that letter? She never left the theater, knowing exactly what the walls contained. The Monarch Theater had finally given up its secret, but the person responsible was still a shadow, hidden just as carefully as Mallory had been. The building had spoken, but not yet told the whole story. And for investigators, the grim discovery only deepened the question of who had turned a place of movies and light into a tomb. When investigators studied the vertical shaft where Mallory Green's remains had been discovered, one detail stood out immediately. The space had no access from the lower levels of the Monarch. The only entry point was through a hatch once located on the projection room floor. To reach it, someone needed both knowledge of the building's original design and opportunity to work in the projection wing unnoticed. This fact narrowed the pool of potential suspects dramatically. It wasn't a random passerby. It wasn't a stranger who lured her outside. Whoever sealed Mallory into that shaft had access, tools, and time. Detectives dug back into the Monarch's renovation history. Permits from 2014 were already suspicious, but an older record from 2012 caught their attention. That year, 2 years before the official remodel, the theater had hired an unlicensed contractor to repair minor fire damage. The paperwork was sparse, but receipts and signatures traced to a name that had not surfaced before: Joseph Delmer. At first glance, Delmer seemed like a routine hire, a man with a background in odd jobs and short-term labor. But when investigators ran his history, the results unsettled them. Delmer had a criminal record, one dotted with disturbing patterns: trespassing charges, some inside abandoned buildings, complaints of voyeurism often dropped before conviction. He was a loner who drifted between low-paying work, rarely holding a steady job for more than a few months. What made him stand out was the timing. Records confirmed that Delmer had worked at the Monarch through September and October of 2013, the very weeks Mallory disappeared. He had access to the projection areas, the maintenance shafts, and the older parts of the building most employees never saw. Detectives attempted to track him down, but the trail led only to another dead end. Joseph Delmer had died in 2021, 4 years before the renovation crew uncovered Mallory's body. The cause was liver failure. He had no living relatives, no children, no one close enough to have been contacted after his passing. But when police gained access to his former apartment, a darker picture emerged. Inside the small one-bedroom unit, investigators found shelves lined with old electronics, surveillance devices, hidden cameras, and crude wiring. There were boxes filled with scrapbooks, each crammed with newspaper clippings. Most were about Louisville, local crimes, fires, missing persons. One binder contained a series of articles about Mallory Green's disappearance. Notes in the margins referenced the Monarch Theater, highlighting architectural quirks and renovation updates. On one page, written in Delmer's shaky hand, were the words, "The building keeps secrets." The discovery was damning but frustrating. Delmer was dead. There would be no confession, no trial, no chance to interrogate him about what happened that October night. What investigators had was circumstantial. His access, his history, his obsession with voyeurism and hidden spaces. The circumstantial trail pointed straight at him, but it wasn't enough to close every gap. How exactly had he encountered Mallory? Did he lure her upstairs, or simply wait until she wandered too close? Was anyone else involved, or had he acted alone? Those questions would remain unanswered. For Donna Green, hearing Delmer's name brought both relief and anguish. Relief that there was finally a face, a person who could be tied to the nightmare she had lived through. Anguish that he had already slipped away, escaping justice by dying before being forced to account for his actions. She sat across from detectives as they laid out photos of his apartment, the surveillance gear, the clippings with her daughter's picture pasted among them. They told her he was almost certainly responsible. But almost wasn't enough. Donna wanted certainty. She wanted every detail. The city wrestled with the revelation. News reports highlighted Delmer's record and the grim artifacts found in his home. For residents, it was confirmation that Mallory's disappearance had not been random. It had been the work of someone embedded in the very structure of the Monarch, a man who had moved quietly, unnoticed, using the building's forgotten bones to cover his crime. And yet, the knowledge felt incomplete, like a puzzle with missing pieces. The Monarch itself remained part of that puzzle. Investigators still couldn't explain every alteration to its layout, every hidden corridor sealed without documentation. They could point to Delmer, but not reconstruct every move he had made inside. In some ways, the theater continued to withhold its secrets, even as the walls had given up Mallory's remains. The suspect was gone. The truth had emerged in fragments, and for Dana, the hollow victory of finally having a name left her with an ache deeper than before. Because even with Joseph Delmer identified, the details of what had happened inside the Monarch Theater and why her daughter had been targeted remained hidden in silence, buried with the man who had taken them. When Mallory Green's body was discovered inside the sealed dumbwaiter shaft, investigators thought the case had reached its end. But Donna Green wasn't finished. For years, she had collected every scrap of information about the Monarch Theater, newspaper archives, fire inspection reports, and old blueprints pulled from the city's planning office. Among those documents was a second set of plans, older and less official, drawn by hand sometime in the 1950s. It showed something the newer records did not: a narrow maintenance corridor leading into a basement level beneath the theater, labeled only as service access, now sealed. Dana brought the blueprint to detectives. At first, it seemed like another obsession-driven theory, but with the building already gutted for renovation, there was no reason not to check. Construction crews marked off the section of wall indicated in the old drawing. Behind plaster and cinder block, they found what looked like a false surface. It took hours of hammering before the sound changed, hollow instead of solid. When the final layer came down, a low, dust-filled passage opened up. The air smelled of mold and decay. Workers shined flashlights inside, revealing a set of concrete steps descending into a room that hadn't been touched in decades. The space was no larger than a single bedroom. Rotting furniture slumped against the walls, its wood soft with water damage. A stained mattress lay on the floor, surrounded by discarded candy wrappers, an old soda can, and scraps of paper too weathered to read. There was a single bare bulb overhead, long burned out, with wires running into the ceiling. It was not a storage room. It was a place meant for someone to live, or to be kept. Forensic teams moved carefully through the hidden basement. Along one wall, they discovered a crude pulley system attached to a square opening. The system connected directly to the same vertical shaft where Mallory's remains had been found. The conclusion was horrifying. The shaft wasn't just a hiding place for a body. It had been part of a larger setup, an improvised mechanism linking the basement room to the projection hallway above. Whoever had created it understood the monarch's forgotten design and had repurposed it into something far darker. The items left behind told investigators that the room had been used around the time of Mallory's disappearance. Candy wrappers dated to 2013. A soda can had a sell-by date from that summer. It suggested that Mallory might not have been killed immediately. She could have been brought down here, alive, hidden while movies played just a few floors above. How long she survived inside that basement was impossible to determine. But the implication that she had endured hours, maybe even days, in captivity before being sealed into the shaft weighed heavily on everyone who entered the space. All evidence pointed back to Joseph Delmer. His brief employment at the Monarch in 2013 had given him unrestricted access to projection areas and maintenance passages. His record of trespassing and voyeurism fit the profile of someone who lingered in hidden spaces. The pulley system and concealed room matched the meticulous, obsessive habits reflected in his scrapbooks. He hadn't just taken Mallory's life. He had constructed an entire environment for her disappearance, a hidden lair engineered from the bones of the building itself. Detectives pieced together a likely timeline. Delmer, familiar with the unused basement and the shaft, had prepared the room long before Mallory vanished. On the night of October 12, 2013, he likely encountered her near the projection hallway. Whether through force or manipulation, he moved her into the hidden space. She may have been kept alive there for a short time, restrained in the dim room as normal life carried on just above. At some point, he struck her, causing the blunt force trauma later confirmed by forensics. Then, using the pulley and the shaft, he concealed her body, sealing the space with insulation and plaster as if erasing her existence entirely. The revelation added a layer of cruelty that shook even seasoned investigators. Mallory's death was not random or opportunistic. It was the result of planning, of knowledge, of a man who had studied the monarch's neglected corners until he could turn them into a weapon. Dana's years of insisting that the building itself was responsible were no longer seen as grief-fueled delusion. She had been right. The theater's walls had not simply hidden her daughter, they had been deliberately manipulated to entomb her. News of the basement spread quickly. For the public, it transformed the Monarch from a nostalgic landmark into something monstrous. Parents who once took their children to Saturday matinees recoiled at the thought of what had existed beneath their feet. For Donna, the discovery was unbearable. The idea that Mallory may have spent her last moments alive in that dark room was worse than any theory she had ever feared. The blueprint Dana had saved, the one she refused to stop studying, had finally forced the building to confess. It revealed not just where Mallory had been hidden, but how she had been kept. And with that revelation came the most devastating truth of all, that her daughter's fate was not sealed in a single moment of violence, but in a slow, deliberate act of cruelty carried out inside a place that had once been trusted by an entire community. Mallory Green's story ended not with justice, but with a burial. After 12 long years of searching, her remains were finally laid to rest on a gray morning in Louisville. Hundreds of people gathered, neighbors, classmates now grown, and strangers who had followed her case from the beginning. They lined the aisles of a modest church, their silence broken only by the sound of the choir and the sobs that rose from the front row. Donna Green walked slowly behind the casket, her body bent by time and grief, her hair now streaked with white. She carried herself like someone who had waited too long for a truth that came too late. Outside, reporters filmed from a distance, documenting the end of a case that had haunted the city for more than a decade. For them, this was closure. For Dana, it was something else entirely. Closure meant resolution, justice, a sense that wrong had been corrected. What she felt was simply finality, an answer without accountability. When the Monarch Theater finally reopened months later, it looked nothing like the crumbling relic Mallory had walked into that October night in 2013. Its Art Deco bones had been polished into sleek modern lines, its walls gleaming with fresh paint, its seats replaced with luxury leather. Families returned, tickets in hand, ready to enjoy the new entertainment complex. But just outside the lobby, near a polished stone column, sat a modest plaque. It bore Mallory's name, carved in neat script, surrounded by flowers placed by strangers who remembered. It was meant to honor her, to acknowledge what had happened there. Yet for many, it felt too small compared to the horror the building had concealed. The company behind the renovation gave careful statements. They expressed sympathy, promised transparency, and insisted they had no knowledge of Joseph Delmer's past or his work inside the Monarch. To the public, they painted him as a drifter, a temporary contractor who slipped through the cracks. But to Dana, it was another betrayal. Someone had hired him, someone had looked the other way, and someone had allowed the theater to cover up its secrets for years. Investigators had no further recourse. Delmer was gone, dead of liver failure 4 years before the truth came out. No accomplices were ever identified. No charges were filed. The case was declared solved in the technical sense, but hollow in every other way. For Dana, the thought of him escaping justice by dying in silence gnawed at her. The discovery of the basement room, the shaft, and the pulley system painted a picture of premeditation so cruel it defied comprehension. And yet, there would be no trial, no verdict, no voice for Mallory in a courtroom. Inside Dana's home, one object remained on display above all others. A framed letter, yellowed slightly with age, written in block letters on lined paper. She never left the theater. Check the old projector room. It had arrived 4 years before Mallory's body was discovered. Whoever sent it had known, or at least suspected, what the police could not prove. Investigators had traced the paper, the ink, and the envelope. They had found nothing. The sender remained as faceless as the crime itself. Donna sometimes wondered if it had been someone complicit, someone guilty but remorseful. Other times, she believed it came from a person too afraid to come forward. Either way, it haunted her. In her final interview with local media, Dinah sat in her living room surrounded by binders of notes, clippings, and photographs. Her voice was soft, worn from years of retelling the same story. She didn't talk about justice or forgiveness or even anger. She spoke only of the Monarch, the building she had studied until its blueprints became etched into her memory. The building knew, she said quietly. It always knew. For the city, the reopening of the Monarch marked progress. Families filled its seats, laughter returned to its hallways, and the plaque outside became just another detail to pass by. But beneath the polished walls, beneath the new flooring and fresh paint, was a history that couldn't be erased. A girl had entered those doors one October night and never walked back out. For 12 years, she had been hidden inside its walls, while life outside went on. Dana Green had received the truth she had demanded for more than a decade. She had stood at her daughter's grave and heard. Investigators confirmed what she always believed, that Mallory had never left the theater. But the truth brought no peace. It was only a reminder of what had been taken, of how long it had been hidden, and of how a city could rebuild a building while a mother lived forever in the ruins of loss.